Hello and welcome to History Hack's dedicated Second World War air power podcast, Hedge-Hopping, with me, Matt Bone. Today we are looking at the Luftwaffe. Now, the Luftwaffe looms large in our collective memory. In a myriad of war movies, they are the baddies. In hundreds of books, they are just the opponent and tend to be referenced in terms of machinery, and our gaze within them tends to turn very quickly to our own side. But today we're going to have a look at the difficulties of researching the Luftwaffe and why our view tends to be as it is. I'm delighted to say we are joined by historian and author Chris Goss. Chris is the author of over 35 books, most of which focus on the Luftwaffe, its men and its machines, including two of my favourites, Luftwaffe fighter bombers over Britain about the tip and run campaign of 42 and 43, and Brothers in Arms, which is all about 609 Squadron and JG53. Chris, thanks for joining us. How are you doing?
Thanks for inviting me, Matt. Yeah, fine. I hope you are and everybody else who's listening in is okay.
Super. Well, we usually open these things with the lockdown question. How has it been for you?
Yeah, how has it been? Long, Groundhog Day-like, longing for going down the pub, going out to a restaurant. Not so much meeting my daughters. It'd be nice to see my daughters for once in a while. And getting away from the wife, because the wife has been working from a second study within our house in the land. She's been working from home for 1 year and the end of 3 weeks now. 1 year, 3 weeks without a break.
We kind of hope the end is in sight, but you don't want to get your hopes up too much.
That's true. That's true.
So I guess let's get cracking on this. So how does a retired RAF wing commander start researching the Luftwaffe?
It goes back to when I was a kid. I was lucky enough to live on the Hampshire-West Sussex border, and being a person of a certain age, I used to meet people of a certain age who used to be there during the war. And it was always interesting chatting to them, going around to their house and saying, did you live around here during the war? And do you remember things? And I can always remember, the one that really sort of stuck in my mind was a Heinkel 11 bomber, which crashed on the cricket pitch of a place called Stansted House, which is not too far from Rowlands Castle, just north of Emsworth. It collided with a tree whilst doing, funny old thing, hedge-hopping on the 8th of October 1940. It crashed there and exploded. Even when I was going around there in the late 70s, early 80s, you could actually pick up chunks of Heinkel still in the ground where the aircraft exploded. And the more you ask the question, I was told one chap had the oxygen bottle from this aircraft, which he was allowed to keep because he could use it as a hot water bottle. And the chap 3 doors down from him had the tail wheel from the aircraft, which was on a wheelbarrow. And that sort of thing, sort of a person of, 16, 17, does fire your imagination. And that's probably the start of it.
Growing up a long way away, those are the stories that you sort of miss, because so many of our guests talk about that sort of period of, we think of it being a long time ago, but the remnants of it were still literally all around us until quite recently.
Well, I was contacting the Luftwaffe fighter pilots in the late 70s, and they were the age now that I am now. So it does put it into perspective. I was born, just about 15 years after the end of, or 16 years after the end of World War II. So yeah, time passes quickly.
So what complexities are there to Luftwaffe studies when compared to Allied ones? I know from my own research on Typhoons, it's quite straightforward because most things are digitized and they're in English. How does that sort of switch when you start looking at Luftwaffe records?
Well, the biggest problem with Luftwaffe records is, of course, they're all in German. And the Germans were meticulous record keepers. For instance, they would keep what we would call the operations records books for our fighter and bomber squadrons. They had an equivalent book like that, and sadly, very, very few of them survived the war, or they were captured and therefore then pulped. But the detail that was in there was incredible. Names, rank numbers, takeoff times, landing times, weather, what they saw, what they didn't saw. It's quite incredible, and that's one of the joys of the Luftwaffe. The other thing also is that the Germans all seem to have a camera, and because the war was going their way in 1940-41, they took lots of photographs. My father-in-law was in the Air Force, and he never took a single photograph during the war. and he regrets that. He regretted that until the day he died.
It's one of the, don't want to say buy your books and look at the pictures, but the pictures are wonderful, and it's those candid moments of the pilots and the crews sitting around, which you could almost swap out the insignia on the uniforms, and they could be the Allied photos that we're so used to. When you come across those, what is the feelings? I suppose that's a really open question. I didn't prep you for this one either, so I'm sorry. It's just those treasure troves of photos that we don't often come across.
Well, it's a joy when you actually get a photograph and you flip it over on the back, and the chap has actually written the date, the time, the unit, what was going on. I'm currently writing a book on the Dornier 217, which was the follow-on bomber for the Dornier 17 Flying Pencil. And I was lucky to contact living in Canada, the family of a German bomber pilot, and the family still had all his medals, all his documentation, apart from his logbook, unfortunately, but all his photographs, and their father had actually put dates and names to every single photograph, which is, for me, it's an absolute joy, because it makes it so easy. And the excitement of when you can look at a photograph and look at a date and look at an incident and match the two up together is quite exciting and very, very satisfying.
That sort of brings us on to my next question about the sort of research and putting it together is, do you approach it any differently, or do you just come at it as the same subject as a group of men? Because you've got I've bookmarked it actually. You've got this fantastic line at the end of Brothers in Arms, which says, one was defending its country, the other was defending aircraft flown by fellow countrymen, as well as being a true fighter unit and fighting against the aircraft of an enemy nation in a combat of life and death. I was taking a moment for that, because it reminds us that these guys were doing essentially the same job, essentially the same reasons. But does that mean you write it in the same way, or do you take it a slightly different approach?
You've got to be very careful, because that was my first book. When I was writing that, I actually had a Battle of Britain pilot who was going to write the foreword, very, very well-known Battle of Britain pilot, who then became a Typhoon pilot. When I told him what the title was, he refused to do he said we were never brothers. We were never brothers in arms. I said, but you were landing at exactly the same time. You were celebrating your victories. Okay, if it was RAF, they were celebrating with beer and Pimm's. The Germans, they were celebrating with champagne and wine. I said the only difference was the language that they were speaking, the markings on the aircraft, and of course one was supporting the aims of an evil dictator.
I guess that's a very fine line to tread.
You got to remember that the likes of you and I weren't there during the war. I can remember going to when I was a schoolboy, we found a hurricane which had crashed in the back garden of somebody's house, and this chap was a mechanic on one squadron on hurricanes during the Battle of Britain, and he didn't realise there was a hurricane in his back garden. And yes, there was a Merlin engine and everything else in there. And I actually contacted the German pilot that was responsible for bringing it down. The hurricane actually collided with the Heinkel, and the German pilot was coming across. And I said, do you mind if we bring him across? And he said, no. He said, I'm not. I saw what those bees did, and I don't want to be friends or meet anybody who's German. And you have to respect that. You have to respect their views, and you have to respect their wishes, because we were not there. We didn't experience what they were doing day in, day out.
Yeah, we have the luxury of time to temper our views. Yeah. So let's get into the Luftwaffe in the Second World War. The first question really is what was the strategic philosophy of the Luftwaffe compared to, say, how the RAF was set up at the beginning of the conflict?
Well, you've got to remember is that the Germans, when they got into World War II, had a tried and tested air force, courtesy of the Spanish Proving Ground. So you've got to remember the Messerschmitt 109 single-seat fighter arrived in Spain as a prototype, and the aircraft that they had at the end of it was the aircraft that we experienced in the Battle of Britain, the Messerschmitt 109E. They had experienced professional aircrew with a very rigid and tried and tested training regime, whilst we in Britain had only just graduated from biplanes onto the Spitfires and the Hurricanes. We had outdated ways of fighting our battle, having battle formations. You have the one that was tried and tested by the Luftwaffe by the German ace Werner Mulders, the Finger Four, which was when you look at the way it operated, two pairs of two, each escorting each other and then operating as a fighting unit of four. That was the battle formation which was adopted by the RAF and was adopted by the American Air Force, because we found out that the Vic formation and having the Weaver above, the two guys who were right at the top of the formation keeping a lookout, who were always the first the Germans used to shoot down.
You mentioned the training philosophy there. What was the training a new Luftwaffe pilot would go through? It's something that changed drastically by the end of the war, but it was very well documented and very almost gate based, wasn't it? You had to get past certain licenses before you could progress to a certain level.
Oh yes, yeah. You go off to various courses. You would, a bit like when I joined the Air Force, you do your officer training and you drill and all the bits and pieces that go with it, and then when you successfully complete that, you go on to your flying training, and then you have various things to jump through, flying, flying this way, flying that way, and then of course then you go on to your what we would call an operational training unit. Well, the Germans had these Jagdfliegerschule fighter pilot schools, before the war, and so these guys were being trained to a high degree as fighter pilots, likewise the bomber pilots, even before the outbreak of war in September 1939. We very much had to play in the RAF a rapid catch-up. Yes, our training was good, but of course it had to accelerate quite quickly. So we were dragging people in from a very small between wars Air Force to actually bolster people. You're seeing also in the Battle of Britain where they're having to take experienced very battled pilots and train them up as Spitfire pilots because we were suffering a shortage. And again, that's something the Germans were going through at the end of the war. They've been flying bombers or flying fighters over the Bay of Biscay with a crew of 3, and then they're put into a single-seat aircraft up against Mustangs, Lightnings, Thunderbolts, Spitfires, you name it. It was very much that sort of situation.
It's that strange, I don't want to say luxury again, but the ability that the Allies then had to send their pilots off somewhere safe to train versus the Luftwaffe pilots who were probably, getting still a high quality training, but were flying in an environment where there was very aggressive people looking for anything in the air to shoot down, which immediately means if you do make it through, A, you've probably used up a good chunk of your luck, and B, you're going up against people that have got possibly hundreds more hours flying in it than you do.
Yeah, we have a family home near Bergerac in southern France. Now, Bergerac was a fighter training airfield, which by the end of 1944 was comfortably within the range of Mosquitoes, Lightnings. The American fighter pilot, Chuck Yeager, he actually was shot down on a mission not too far from Bordeaux, not too far from where we live down there. So it shows how far their single-seat fighters were getting. During the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe, the range was you could just about make it to the outer skirts of the southern outskirts of London, and then of course you had 7 minutes flying time before you came back. They couldn't imagine flying an aircraft all the way down to the south of France and then flying around, shooting up training aircraft and coming back again.
So that brings us on to equipment quite nicely. It's almost like we've planned this. How did the sort of politics and of the Luftwaffe's procurement come in? Because you've written the book on the HE-177, which is a long and torrid tale of infighting to get that aircraft. Well, it never really arrived, did it? But how did that stop them from getting the equipment even that they needed?
Throughout the design and development of many of the German aircraft which came in towards the end of the war, it was political interference or military interference or a lack of the right engines which caused the problem. You talk about the Heinkel 177, which was a very, very advanced aircraft which had 2 engines essentially powering one propeller. And the idea of that aircraft, it was going to be a long-range aircraft. The Luftwaffe wanted it as a dive bomber. Well, you don't want to dive a 4-engined aircraft, do you? It had a revolutionary cooling system, which was found to be inadequate because of the engines they used. As a result, the engine started to overheat. So they then had to put radiators in, which increased the drag on the aircraft, which meant you had to use more powerful engines, and the more powerful engines were found to be substandard, and as a result, they used to catch fire. The aircraft was called the Reichspetrol, lighter, because it was always catching fire. And this is an aircraft that first flew in November 1939. It didn't go operational until November 1943, And even then, it was being chopped out of the sky because it was arriving too late.
I find we can get kind of geeky here, but the lack of the raw materials that go into just making an engine, making a ball, something as simple as a ball bearing, that would have those knock-on effects to make these quite advanced engines highly, highly unreliable. I think you mentioned in your tip and run book about the FW190s that were reaching the squadrons in 42 and 43, where they had terrible reliability troubles despite the fright that they were putting into the RAF at the same time.
It could be something as basic as glue. The Heinkel 162, the revolutionary, essentially plywood single engine fighter, which came out at the end of the war. The RAF bombed the factory, which made the glue to stick the aircraft together. They therefore had to have a second factory which produced substandard glue. And during the test flights, the aircraft was finding that bits were breaking off it. So, don't just think engines, you can think, or ball bearings. It's even down to the quality of the glue that was being used.
And I was reading Callum Douglas's book about the secret horsepower race, and he's got that fascinating section on the additives in the fuel that then started eating the fuel tank linings in the Messerschmitts and the FW190s, and that simple change that wasn't worked out all the way through just to make more of something had such catastrophic incidents.
Necessity is the mother of invention, but you have to, every now and again, you have to stop and pause and think about, are we going the right way? Are we going down the wrong alleyway? When you need to sort of make sure everything's okay. That's the unusual thing about some of the aircraft the Germans introduced came through without a hitch. The Dornier 217. That first flew. It was being operated by the middle of 1943, but because it was meant to be the aircraft to replace the Dornier 17, it was rushed in. Even though the aircraft was sufficient, it was the training for the crew, and then coming up against a new enemy, which were British night fighters equipped with airborne radar. They had to adapt. So you couldn't fly straight to a target and straight back. It was a series of, you go there low level, climb to altitude, and then you're all over the place and hope your gyros haven't tumbled, hope that you haven't been picked up by an airborne or a ground controlled night fighter, find your target, drop the bombs and get back home again.
The stress levels on a normal op in a straight line would have been massively high, but to throw in all of that as well must have been terrifying.
Yeah, a friend of mine, he was a Junkers 188 pilot, and he was shot down the first night that they used the Junkers 188, which is the replacement for the 88, in an attack on London, and he was hit by anti-aircraft fire, which meant he didn't have the full maneuverability of his aircraft. And he was picked up by a night fighter, and his crew were shouting, "It's getting closer! It's getting closer! It's getting." There was absolutely nothing he could do. And he said the aircraft opened fire, and he was the only person. He had an armored seat in the aircraft, and he cringed, and he could hear the bullets hitting the aircraft. Killed his 3 crew, set fire to his aircraft. He got out without a scratch, but there was absolutely nothing. And can you imagine that? Flying down the Thames, and you can see something is creeping up behind you, getting closer and closer, knowing it's going to open fire on you, and it's going to bring death and destruction to your aircraft and crew.
It's a fascinating parallel to the stories that we're probably more used to hearing about the Lancaster and Halifax crews that would have that similar experience over Germany. The shared experience that these crews had is very strong, isn't it?
Well, I again, some years ago, friend of the family, he was a flight engineer on Halifaxes, and he was shot down in October 1943, a week after this German Junkers 188 pilot was. And the German pilot came over, took him to a pub, got him to meet Jerry, and the two of them did not stop talking about what it was like and tactics and techniques for 3 hours. They did not stop talking for 3 hours solid. It was quite something to behold, and quite something to listen to.
Wonderful. We've sort of jumped straight to where things started to go wrong. But for you, what was the high point of the Luftwaffe's war? When did that happen?
There are some people think that the high point of the war was the Poland campaign, because from then on they started suffering losses. You look at the Battle of France. Yes, they had superior firepower. They did extremely well, but goodness gracious me, the number of bombers they lost, and that's against you know, an alleged second-rate French Air Force, which was doing okay, and a very, very small RAF. The Battle of Britain wasn't a success. The early parts of the Battle of the Atlantic, when of course they had the Focke-Wulf Condor 4-engined aircraft, and they were able to go from bases in France right the way out into the Atlantic and attack ships which were undefended. And of course, they would be able to attack them at low level, and that's why so many of that crew got the Knight's Cross. It's difficult to actually say that where was the roaring success, because each success seems to be sort of tempered by failure.
I was just reading your article in the new Airplane Monthly about the Condor raids on just outside my missus's old stomping ground in Scotland, to the hydroelectric plants up there. That's remarkable, and something that had never crossed my mind, that there were those sorts of raids being operated from Brittany as far north as Scotland. That's mind blowing, and that we haven't heard about it, despite the fact that there's a bomb in the museum, bomb in the factory on display.
Yeah, it is an unusual story, and it was only because a Junkers 88 reconnaissance aircraft, and they'd only just recently got those aircraft, converting from an older type, and they were based in Stavanger Solar in Norway. They'd flown across, bombed a hydroelectric plant, which must have come as a hell of a shock to the people to the west of Scotland. But then on the way out, spot a convoy anchored up off Oban, and they radio in, and that evening the convoy is attacked unmolested by 5 Focke-Wulf Condors, which attacked at low level because there was nothing there to shoot back at them.
That is a remarkable aircraft, the Condor. Not only is it very pretty, and not that we rate aircraft on aesthetics only, but it achieved so much for an aircraft that didn't particularly have the bomb load that one would expect. In your article, you're talking about only literally a handful of not huge bombs being dropped on that convoy, but the effect that they had across the North Atlantic as well was massive compared to the number that they actually had. Because again, it was a reasonably small unit, wasn't it?
A very small unit. There was only one unit. Most German units are made up of 3 wings of 3 squadrons each. Well, from the Condor's perspective, they only had one wing of them, and of course the aircraft wasn't designed as a bomber, it was designed as an airliner, so it had its own little problems that came with it, but it fitted what they wanted to do, which was basically being based in Bordeaux or being based in Brest. They could go out with gay abandon, knowing exactly what they could do. And of course, the famous thing is the sinking of the Empress of Britain, which was a massive troop ship, and it was attacked by a Condor, which was damaged slightly by anti-aircraft fire by one of the defending aircraft. But they managed to put a bomb virtually down the smokestack. It's quite amazing, and the pilot, as a result of that, gets the Knight's Cross.
As we're sort of looking, we've sort of touched on this before. We sort of look at the effectiveness of the Luftwaffe as the war goes on, as a sort of steady decline. Was it anything specific, or was it this complete sort of loss of trained men, good materials, reliability? Was it all of these things compounding due to the effects of the Allied offensive against them, or was there something that played against their ability to continue the fight in any way?
Well, you've got to realise one of the things you're taught is selection and maintenance of aim, and of course you can't do that when you're fighting a war in Russia, fighting a war across the Atlantic, fighting a war in Northwest Europe, fighting a war in the Mediterranean and North Africa. Of course, then with the Americans coming into the war, bringing their massive industrial capability, notwithstanding the bombers, but their fighters were superlative. The Mustang, the Lightning, the Thunderbolt, which was twice as heavy as a Spitfire, and they could range far and wide across there. And of course, add all that together, a war changing, the Russians being able to, the Soviets being able to push back because basically they have the manpower and they have the people to do that. It was a combination of everything that spelt the end, really.
Yeah, I have a note here saying great kit, small numbers. Do we maybe spend a bit too much time fetishizing the equipment over the realities of what they were up against.
Some of the equipment was superb, but it was always a case of too little, too late. The Messerschmitt 262, jet fighter, very, very difficult to shoot down. But then, of course, the Germans wanted to use it as a bomber when they had plenty of other things. The Heinkel 219 night fighter, it was fitted with an ejection seat, for goodness sake. Lovely aircraft, but it was coming in far too late to make a difference. And then you have some of these, as we said before, the Heinkel 162. And you've seen some of the things, the very well-known British test pilot, Eric Winkle Brown, tested a number of these aircraft at the end of the war. And, his comment about the Heinkel 219 for us was, could have been, it was a good job for us that, it was superior to the Mosquito, in his opinion. The Heinkel 162 could have held its own comfortably against a Tempest, which was, again, another superlative. But again, it was when the war ended, the airfield at Lech in Germany was lined up with Heinkel 162s, which never fired a shot in anger. Thank goodness for the RAF.
Throughout all your research, and we sort of were chatting about this earlier, what resonates for you? Is it? I take it it's not so much the equipment, is it?
I'm not a person when I write my books. It's not, and they took off flying an aircraft with a serial number, and they went to this height. It's the personal aspects of what it was like to be. It's the people, because without the people and the skill of those people, you wouldn't have an effective weapon in a Messerschmitt 262 or a Messerschmitt 109. And I was very lucky to meet the daughter of Germany's top night fighter pilot, Helmut Lent. Amazingly, she lives in this country now, and going to meet her and seeing what she had from her father, and seeing her, who looks exactly like her father. He was killed in an accident in October 1944 after having been received. He was the top scoring night fighter pilot at the time, having flown in Poland, Battle of Britain, then converted to night fighter right the way through. He had the Knight's Cross with oak leaf swords and diamonds, the top award. It was quite humbling to think that she was allowing me to see personal records, photographs of her father's funeral, the record of service for her father, the what we would call the operational order, which was the instruction for all the people who were attending her father's funeral, who was going to stand where and who's going to. And he looked at it, and it was like going through a list of the top scoring fighter pilots of the war, those who had survived to 1944. That's for me, it's the personal, it's the man or the woman on the ground who or in the air who had to do all this.
And again, we come back to that treading a fine line, because they were fighting for a terrible, evil regime. I'm trying to form a sort of follow-up to that, which I suppose is highlighting what they went through and what they, for the most part, didn't live through, but not celebrating it. Is that what I'm looking for? Which must be a very tricky thing to do when you're putting a book together.
It is. It's quite, another example to give you. In my book I'm doing on the Dornier 217, I've got a copy of a logbook from a German pilot who had only recently joined his squadron, and he was sent out in, I think, February 1943 to drop 4 bombs in daylight on the centre of Reading, which is just down the road from me. He did that with such great success. It killed 42 people, because one of the bombs landed on the most popular cafe in Reading at the time. And there is an award. And the guy, he was killed in 1943 flying against Britain. These people now, I've come across it where people, the son said, well, my father said he'd never, ever flown against London. And he said, I've just found his diary. And he flew against London again and again and again. I said, sorry, but he had, by the time he got shot down, he had nearly 200 bombing missions. You've got to be very, very careful, because, the memories of the bombings of Reading, and the same day I think they attacked a railway station. Another aircraft attacked a railway station just outside Guildford, not too far from where you live, Matt. And there's a plaque there to the people who were killed on that day. It was total war, to use the terms of von Clausewitz. And you've got to remember that, the guys up in the air doing something were prosecuting a war, and the poor people on the ground, 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds killed when a bomb goes through their house when they're sleeping at night. One I just found recently was when the Germans used anti-personnel mines bombing Grimsby. And these things, they were very, very small, but they hang from telegraph wires, they hang from gutters or whatever else. And you go and hit them with a stick and they go off. And they said one of these came through the roof. And there was two women who were in the same bedroom. They saw this thing hanging there. They tried to cut it down, and exploded, killing both of them. That sort of thing you can't forgive and you can't forget.
And then those butterfly bombs were copied and used by the Allies a year later.
Very successfully, yeah.
I'm sort of relatively new to sort of researching specific operations and things like that. But the thing that's always noticeable to me is trying to get the other side of a story. So, one of the things I've looked at is the 263's bad day when they went up against Brest and were bounced by FW-190s of the maritime unit. And there's that classic sort of series of gun camera images from Derek Erasmus' Typhoon of him shooting down, I think it's George Sievert.
Was, yeah. The Squadron Commander 268.
Yeah, his CO had literally just been shot down by Sievert, and then he got Sievert. It's an example I've used a few times because it's one of those occasions where you can actually tell the whole story and actually put names to a lot of people. And I think that's important because it can get, I don't want to say bloodthirsty, but it can get a little bit grim when you're still celebrating something like, because it is an amazing series of images, but you are literally watching a man die. I find it quite moving to when you have those opportunities to start telling these stories around. And I suppose it's something that you've found quite often, is that ability to actually tell a story in a round, as opposed to it was this mission, they came back with X number of victories and that was it.
That's quite funny. I recently got hold of a copy of that, of the camera gun stills for that, which are very, 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 you can see the aircraft very clearly. You can see the bullets are hitting the cockpit. And of course, being a Typhoon, those were 20mm shells hitting it. And this guy had just done exactly the same to Flight Sergeant Erasmus's squadron commander. And that is why in the village, the Focke-Wulf 190 crashed a little bit further on than the Typhoon. One of the most interesting ones is the shooting down of the actor Leslie Howard over the Bay of Biscay. Something that, for those who don't know, Leslie Howard, star of Gone with the Wind, the Spitfire story, quite a well-known between wars, Hollywood superstar. His aircraft was shot down over the Bay of Biscay on the way back from Lisbon, and I interviewed the German squadron commander. They just happened to be in the wrong place at the right time that day. It was not a British aircraft. It wasn't a German aircraft. They tried to fort it down, and the Dutch crew which were flying it, legged it, so they shot it down. And on board was Leslie Howard, a mother with 2 children, quite a lot. There were no military personnel on board, and it really is when you see the photographs of the aircraft then burning on the water, that is the final resting place of a Hollywood superstar.
And all those silly conspiracy theories around it are not true. It was just it was an opportunity, wasn't it? They didn't go looking for him or anything silly like that. They
were meant to be escorting U-boats in that day. They didn't find a U-boat, so they had time to spare, so they went out a little bit further. And unfortunately, they went out a little bit further to actually bump into this transport aircraft. And having interviewed the guy, he said, the German squadron commander, he said, if we'd known who was on board, could you imagine the propaganda? He said we would have escorted it back in. Shooting it down didn't do us and it didn't serve us anything. If we'd escorted him back to Bordeaux, and then he would have been paraded around Berlin as the man who portrayed Reginald Mitchell in the Spitfire story. But conspiracy will always be there. I've had some very nasty experiences where saying the Germans were lying. Well, I'm actually sitting here next to me here is the actual German report of exactly what happened. And, why would the Germans lie about it when they got it in black and white there?
The bad joke about that was they went after him because they didn't like First of the Few, which is a wonderful film which tells a complete fantasy story of the Spitfire, but it's also the only remaining footage of the S4, which is a movie geek sort of reference for you if you're keeping score. We sort of spoke earlier about this being sort of the first of hopefully a couple chats that we're going to have with you, Chris.
If you have me back, of course.
I'd love to, because the Biscay campaign, I think, I don't want to get into it too much here, but that's one that we don't tend to cover. And you've written about Bloody Biscay. That is a fascinating campaign, mainly because it's covering so many different aspects. You have the U-boats, you have everything, but above them you have this screen of not only Condors but just about every type you can think of with a long range tank strapped to it, trying to help. What for you sort of drew you to that? Was the fact that no one else had really spent any time on it, or was it something else that led you to it?
Well, as a child, we used to have holidays down there, La Rochelle, Les Sables d'Olonne. Of course, the U-boat pens are still down there. I think you can go down there now. I think they're so thick and so big they can't destroy them. I think one of them actually displays art. And I got interested in it. It was something that and nobody else had written. People had written about U-boat war. They'd written about various little aspects of it, but they'd never done the German side, because the Germans only had one squadron, proper squadron, which was a night fighter squadron being used at daytime. So a night fighter aircraft being used in the daytime, because it was the only aircraft that would go out as far as it could. And it could hold its own against, or shoot down quite with gay abandon Whitleys and Wellingtons and whatever, which again caused this escalation. We then would send out bow fighters. They would send out more. Then there would be these big battles over the Bay of Biscay. Then they put Focke-Wulf 190s, as you just mentioned earlier on, which of course caused they intercepted a formation of Lancasters on the way back from Turin, one of which was being flown by Wing Commander Nettleton of the Victoria Cross. They shot that down over the Bay of Biscay, and because the aircraft crashed in the sea, and a lot of the Germans then didn't survive the war, it was a forgotten aspect. And the book has been reprinted 3-4 times, and there's still a lot of interest there.
A friend of ours, Maren Walters, was sort of saying the other day, it never ceases to amaze her how many more stories are yet to be found and to be told of a conflict that we would think has been pretty well covered 70, 80 years after the fact.
But a very good friend of mine, Peter Cornwall, who is well known in aviation circles, he's retired now, but he wrote the Battle of Britain Then and Now, and he did the Battle of France Then and Now, and he was quite an expert on the Battle of Britain. He said, I wrote these books 30 years ago. He said, and it was based on the best information available at the time. He said, people will continue to turn up things. They've turned up German records in an archive in the Soviet, in Russia, which were captured by the Soviets. And he said, he has to take the hat off to the new people who are coming along, who are coming out with the new information. But at the same time, there are other people who will continue to not regurgitate, will continue to agree with or continue to follow the line of what was said 30 or 40 years ago when there is new information available. And people will say, well, why didn't they say that then? Because it wasn't there. I've just finishing off today the operations over the Mediterranean by the Dornier 217 unit, which carried these glider bombs. And there's been a number of books have been written on it, a number of very good books, but it only scratches the surface. One of the German aircraft is shot down and crashes at Benidorm on the way back. So you've got them trying to launch guided weapons against Allied Condors, Allied convoys, and then of course then are crashing back in where we all go on. Well, we would all like to go on holiday now.
It's an endlessly fascinating subject, and like I said, we will be definitely having you back to sort of diving into a specific campaign, because I just wanted to take the opportunity today, and I can't thank you enough to just spend some time thinking more broadly about it, because it is very easy for me doing this show stick to the easy stuff, because I know people are going to listen if I talk about Spitfires. I know they're going to listen if I speak about, I get someone on to talk about Mustangs. But it is tricky to talk about, the Luftwaffe, and hopefully going to be doing a show about sinking of Force Z by the Japanese, but from the Japanese Imperial Navy perspective. It's tricky to find sort of researchers and authors like yourselves, because it seems a lot more straightforward to stick to the easy stuff. I don't want to call it easy, because it's never easy.
Never easy, but I will be. I am no expert on the Eastern Front. I'm no expert on the Mediterranean, because if I did that, it would be all consuming. And I will admit, I've been lucky. I've been lucky enough when I was younger to be invited to German fighter pilots reunions out in Germany. And when they found out, I'm Air Force, as I was then, one chap came up to me and he said, would you like to see my Knight's Cross? And I went, oh, yes, please. And he took it out of his top pocket. He said, I can't show it off, he said, because it's got a band badge. But it wasn't just the Knight's Cross, it was the Knight's Cross with oak leaves. And this guy had 120 kills. And he said to me, one thing I've always wanted to know is who shot me down and took prisoner in North Africa. Did some research and came back, and I said, I've got your answer. He said, I hope it's not American. I said, it was a Spitfire being flown by an American. And he was very, very very happy about that. And 3 months later, he'd passed away.
Oh, that I've been fortunate to meet a few veterans, and it's one of those experiences that you kind of aware, even though you're having a glass of wine and a great natter with someone like Colin Bell, for example, who's 100 years young and still going strong. That's something that we should cherish, and those experiences we should be documenting as much as we have.
Yeah, like that, going to the same reunion and seeing a chap sitting by himself, and they said, oh, you know who he is? And I said, no, he is the guy he is an armourer. He is the guy who designed the jazz music obliquely mounted cannon which they used on night fighters. And if those people would like to just look up Schrager music, it was something means that they could fly underneath Allied bombers unseen and fire up into the fuel tanks without being seen. And this guy, he was sitting there having his beer, very, very quiet, a bit portly. Paul Mahler was the guy who actually came up with the idea of this.
All connotations aside, is an elegant solution to the problem that they were facing. Which, to be fair, war tends to do. You do come up with some very imaginative solutions to tricky situations, of which something as simple as frequency hopping for radio controlled torpedoes that we use every day, and which was just making noise in the background a minute ago as my Bluetooth suddenly connected to a speaker on the other side of the room.
But that's what you need. So you need a war or a crisis. Look at COVID. That COVID is a crisis, and look how quickly we have got this plethora now, thank goodness, vaccinations. And Second World War was no excuse to that. First World War is exactly the same. As I said before, necessity is the mother of invention, and the biggest kick up the pants is a war or a panic or a pandemic.
I'd like to start wrapping things up, because I've got a whole pile more questions, but I'm going to save for when we start talking about Biscay or the tip and run raids, because we could be here for a long time, and it's Friday afternoon after all, and there's bottles of wine in the other room that are calling to us. I should no doubt. So, Chris, thank you so much for joining us. When is the 217 book due?
The first one is coming out by Osprey, which is their little series, and that's due out in September. I have to finish. This is a big one along the lines of my book on the Dornier 17 and the Focke-Wulf 200 Condor for Cressy. That is going to be finished by August, September, but that won't be out until this time next year.
And ladies and gentlemen, if you're listening, Brothers in Arms is wonderful, and my dear friend on the show, Chris Sams, author of early Bomber Command books, he basically has worn out copies of that book. He's read it so many times. So on behalf of him and us, thank you so much, Chris. We're going to have you back. We shall get that in the diary, and we'll get the word out for that, and we will pick one of your other books to have a look at. And I think Biscay is the one that we're going to dive into. So thank you so much.
Okay, pleasure. Stay safe.
I'd like to thank Chris Goss once again for joining us on History Hack's Hedge-Hopping. We have put Brothers in Arms and Luftwaffe fighter bombers over Britain on our very own bookshop. If you head to bookshop.org/shop/history hack, you can find the books from our latest guests available for you to purchase on there. Every sale sees 10% come towards supporting History Hack, and we thank you for all the wonderful ways that you support the podcast, whether it's through buying books, through Patreon, or just by spreading the word. You are amazing. Thank you very much. And as we've mentioned Patreon, time for the Patreon bit. In 2020, when the boss ladies, Alex and Alina, started History Hack, the world was very strange. And unfortunately, it looks like 2021 is going to be equally strange. We would love it if you're able to support the podcast in any way. It will allow us to keep up the regularity of the pods and also the great guests that we've been able to bring you over the last year. We exist on Patreon as History Hack and also on Podbean, our podcast host's own platform called Patreon. The reward tiers are being updated at the moment, so there's going to be some fantastic options for you to choose from. So if you're able to support us, that would be fantastic. So we thank you very much, and until the next time.